Chapter 43. The Shame of the Sun was published in October. As Martin cut the cords of the express package and the half-dozen complimentary copies from the publisher spilled out on the table, a heavy sadness fell upon him. He thought of the wild delight that would have been his had this happened a few short months before, and he contrasted that delight that should have been with his present uncaring coldness. His book, his first book, and his pulse had not gone up a fraction of a beat, and he was only sad. It meant little to him now. The most it meant was that it might bring some money, and little enough did he care for money. He carried a copy out into the kitchen and presented it to Maria. "I did it," he explained, in order to clear up her bewilderment. "I wrote it in the room there, and I guess some few quarts of your vegetable soup went into the making of it. Keep it, it's yours. Just to remember me by, you know." He was not bragging, not showing off. His sole motive was to make her happy, to make her proud of him, to justify her long faith in him. She put the book in the front room, on top of the family Bible. A sacred thing was this book her lodger had made, a fetish of friendship. It softened the blow of his having been a laundryman, and though she could not understand a line of it, she knew that every line of it was great. She was a simple, practical, hard-working woman, but she possessed faith in large endowment. Just as emotionlessly as he had received The Shame of the Sun, did he read the reviews of it that came in weekly from the clipping bureau. The book was making a hit, that was evident. It meant more than gold in the money sack. He could fix up Lizzie, redeem all his promises, and still have enough left to build his little grass-walled castle. Singletree, Darnley and Company had cautiously brought out an edition of 1,500 copies, but the first reviews had started a second edition of twice that size through the presses, and ere this was delivered, a third edition of 5,000 had been ordered. A London firm made arrangements by cable for an English edition, and hot-footed upon this came the news of French, German, and Scandinavian translations in progress. The attack upon the Maeterlinck school could not have been made at a more opportune moment. A fierce controversy was precipitated. Saleeby and Hackle endorsed and defended The Shame of the Sun, for once finding themselves on the same side of a question. Crooks and Wallace ranged up on the opposing side, while Sir Oliver Lodge attempted to formulate a compromise that would jibe with his particular cosmic theories. Maeterlinck's followers rallied around the standard of mysticism. Chesterton set the whole world laughing with a series of alleged, non-partisan essays on the subject, and the whole affair, controversy and controversialists, was well nigh swept into the pit by a thundering broadside from George Bernard Shaw. Needless to say, the arena was crowded with hosts of lesser lights, and the dust and sweat and din became terrific. "It is a most marvelous happening," Singletree, Darnley and Company wrote Martin. "A critical philosophic essay selling like a novel. You could not have chosen your subject better, and all contributory factors have been unwarrantedly propitious. We need scarcely to assure you that we are making hay while the sun shines. Over 40,000 copies have already been sold in the United States and Canada, and a new edition of 20,000 is on the presses. We are overworked trying to supply the demand. Nevertheless, we have helped to create that demand. We have already spent $5,000 in advertising. The book is bound to be a record breaker. Please find herewith a contract in duplicate for your next book, which we have taken the liberty of forwarding to you. You will please note that we have increased your royalties to 20%, which is about as high as a conservative publishing house dares to go. If our offer is agreeable to you, please fill in the proper blank space with the title of your book. We make no stipulations concerning its nature. Any book on any subject. If you have one already written, so much the better. Now is the time to strike. The iron could not be hotter. On receipt of signed contract, we shall be pleased to make you an advance on royalties of $5,000. You see, we have faith in you, and we are going in on this thing big. We should like also to discuss with you the drawing up of a contract for a term of years, say 10, during which we shall have the exclusive rights of publishing in book form all that you produce, but more of this anon." Martin laid down the letter and worked a problem in mental arithmetic, finding the product of 15 cents times 60,000 to be $9,000. He signed the new contract, inserting "the smoke of joy" in the blank space, and mailed it back to the publishers along with the 20 storiettes he had written in the days before he discovered the formula for the newspaper storiette. And promptly as the United States mail could deliver and return, came Singletree, Darnley and Company's check for $5,000. "I want you to come downtown with me, Maria, this afternoon at 2 o'clock," Martin said, the morning the check arrived. "Or, better, meet me at 14th and Broadway at 2 o'clock. I'll be looking out for you." At the appointed time she was there, but shoes was the only clue to the mystery her mind had been capable of evolving, and she suffered a distinct shock of disappointment when Martin walked her right by a shoe store and dived into a real estate office. What happened thereupon resided forever after in her memory as a dream. Fine gentlemen smiled at her benevolently as they talked with Martin and one another. A typewriter clicked. Signatures were affixed to an imposing document. Her own landlord was there too, and affixed his signature. And when all was over and she was outside on the sidewalk, her landlord spoke to her, saying, "Well, Maria, you won't have to pay me no $7.50 this month." Maria was too stunned for speech. "Or next month, or the next, or the next," her landlord said. She thanked him incoherently, as if for a favor. And it was not until she had returned home to North Oakland and conferred with her own kind and had the Portuguese grocer investigate that she really knew that she was the owner of the little house in which she had lived and for which she had paid rent so long. "Why don't you trade with me no more?" the Portuguese grocer asked Martin that evening, stepping out to hail him when he got off the car, and Martin explained that he wasn't doing his own cooking any more, and then went in and had a drink of wine on the house. He noted it was the best wine the grocer had in stock. "Maria," Martin announced that night, "I'm going to leave you, and you're going to leave here yourself soon. Then you can rent the house and be a landlord yourself. You've a brother in San Leandro, or Hayward's, and he's in the milk business. I want you to send all your washing back unwashed, understand? Unwashed. And go out to San Leandro tomorrow, or Hayward's, or wherever it is, and see that brother of yours. Tell him to come and see me. I'll be stopping at the Metropole downtown in Oakland. He'll know a good milk ranch when he sees one." And so it was that Maria became a landlord and the sole owner of a dairy, with 2 hired men to do the work for her, and a bank account that steadily increased, despite the fact that her whole brood wore shoes and went to school. Few persons ever meet the fairy princes they dream about, but Maria, who worked hard and whose head was hard, never dreaming about fairy princes, entertained hers in the guise of an ex-laundryman. In the meantime, the world had begun to ask, who is this Martin Eden? He had declined to give any biographical data to his publishers, but the newspapers were not to be denied. Oakland was his own town, and the reporters nosed out scores of individuals who would supply information. All that he was and was not, all that he had done, and most of what he had not done, was spread out for the delectation of the public, accompanied by snapshots and photographs, the latter procured from the local photographer who had once taken Martin's picture and who promptly copyrighted it and put it on the market. At first, so great was his disgust with the magazines and all bourgeois society, Martin fought against publicity. But in the end, because it was easier than not to, he surrendered. He found that he could not refuse himself to the special writers who traveled long distances to see him. Then again, each day was so many hours long, and, since he no longer was occupied with writing and studying, those hours had to be occupied somehow. So he yielded to what was to him a whim, permitted interviews, gave his opinions on literature and philosophy, and even accepted invitations of the bourgeoisie. He had settled down into a strange and comfortable state of mind. He no longer cared. He forgave everybody, even the cub reporter who had painted him red, and to whom he now granted a full page with specially posed photographs. He saw Lizzie occasionally, and it was patent that she regretted the greatness that had come to him. It widened the space between them. Perhaps it was with the hope of narrowing it that she yielded to his persuasions to go to night school and business college, and to have herself gowned by a wonderful dressmaker who charged outrageous prices. She improved visibly from day to day, until Martin wondered if he was doing right, for he knew that all her compliance and endeavor was for his sake. She was trying to make herself of worth in his eyes, of the sort of worth he seemed to value. Yet he gave her no hope, treating her in brotherly fashion and rarely seeing her. Overdue was rushed upon the market by the Meredith Lowell Company in the height of his popularity, and being fiction, in point of sales it made even a bigger strike than The Shame of the Sun. Week after week, his was the credit of the unprecedented performance of having 2 books at the head of the list of bestsellers. Not only did the story take with the fiction readers, but those who read The Shame of the Sun with avidity were likewise attracted to the sea story by the cosmic grasp of mastery with which he had handled it. First, he had attacked the literature of mysticism, and had done it exceeding well, and next, he had successfully supplied the very literature he had exposited, thus proving himself to be that rare genius, a critic and a creator in one. Money poured in on him, fame poured in on him. He flashed, comet-like, through the world of literature, and he was more amused than interested by the stir he was making. One thing was puzzling him, a little thing that would have puzzled the world had it known, but the world would have puzzled over his bepuzzlement rather than over the little thing that to him loomed gigantic. Judge Blount invited him to dinner. That was the little thing, or the beginning of the little thing, that was soon to become the big thing. He had insulted Judge Blount, treated him abominably, and Judge Blount, meeting him on the street, invited him to dinner. Martin bethought himself of the numerous occasions on which he had met Judge Blount at the Morses, and when Judge Blount had not invited him to dinner. Why had he not invited him to dinner then? He asked himself. He had not changed. He was the same Martin Eden. What made the difference? The fact that the stuff he had written had appeared inside the covers of books. But it was work performed. It was not something he had done since. It was achievement accomplished at the very time Judge Blount was sharing this general view and sneering at his Spencer and his intellect. Therefore, it was not for any real value, but for a purely fictitious value, that Judge Blount invited him to dinner. Martin grinned and accepted the invitation, marveling the while at his complacence, and at the dinner where, with their womenkind, were half a dozen of those that sat in high places, and where Martin found himself quite the lion, Judge Blount, warmly seconded by Judge Hanwell, urged privately that Martin should permit his name to be put for the Sticks, the ultra-select club to which belonged not the mere men of wealth, but the men of attainment. And Martin declined, and was more puzzled than ever. He was kept busy disposing of his heap of manuscripts. He was overwhelmed by requests from editors. It had been discovered that he was a stylist, with meat under his style. The Northern Review, after publishing The Cradle of Beauty, had written him for half a dozen similar essays, which would have been supplied out of the heap had not Burton's Magazine, in a speculative mood, offered him $500 each for 5 essays. He wrote back that he would supply the demand, but at $1,000 an essay. He remembered that all these manuscripts had been refused by the very magazines that were now clamoring for them. And their refusals had been cold-blooded, automatic, stereotyped. They had made him sweat, and now he intended to make them sweat. Barton's Magazine paid his price for 5 essays, and the remaining 4, at the same rate, were snapped up by Mackintosh's Monthly the Northern Review being too poor to stand the pace. Thus went out to the world the high priests of mystery, the wonder dreamers, the yardstick of the ego, philosophy of illusion, God and clod, art and biology, critics and test tubes, stardust, and the dignity of usury, to raise storms and rumblings and mutterings that were many a day in dying down. Editors wrote to him telling him to name his own terms, which he did, but it was always for work performed. He refused resolutely to pledge himself to any new thing. The thought of again setting pen to paper maddened him. He had seen Brissenden torn to pieces by the crowd, and despite the fact that him the crowd acclaimed, he could not get over the shock nor gather any respect for the crowd. His very popularity seemed a disgrace and a treason to Brissenden. It made him wince, but he made up his mind to go on and fill the money bag. He received letters from editors like the following. About a year ago we were unfortunate enough to refuse your collection of love poems. We were greatly impressed by them at the time, but certain arrangements already entered into prevented our taking them. If you still have them, and if you will be kind enough to forward them, we shall be glad to publish the entire collection on your terms. We are also prepared to make a most advantageous offer for bringing them out in book form. Martin recollected his blank verse tragedy and sent it instead. He read it over before mailing and was particularly impressed by its sophomoric amateurishness and general worthlessness. But he sent it, and it was published, to the everlasting regret of the editor. The public was indignant and incredulous. It was too far a cry from Martin Eden's high standard to that serious bosh. It was asserted that he had never written it, that the magazine had faked it very clumsily, or that Martin Eden was emulating the elder Dumas, and at the height of success was hiring his writing done for him. But when he explained that the tragedy was an early effort of his literary childhood, and that the magazine had refused to be happy unless it got it, a great laugh went up at the magazine's expense, and a change in the editorship followed. The tragedy was never brought out in book form, though Martin pocketed the advance royalties that had been paid. Coleman's Weekly sent Martin a lengthy telegram, costing nearly $300, offering him $1,000 an article for 20 articles. He was to travel over the United States with all expenses paid, and select whatever topics interested him. The body of the telegram was devoted to hypothetical topics in order to show him the freedom of range that was to be his. The only restriction placed upon him was that he must confine himself to the United States. Martin sent his inability to accept and his regrets by wire, collect. Weeky Weeky, published in Warren's Monthly, was an instantaneous success. It was brought out forward in a wide-margined, beautifully decorated volume that struck the holiday trade and sold like wildfire. The critics were unanimous in the belief that it would take its place with those two classics by two great writers, The Bottle Imp and The Magic Skin. The public, however, received the Smoke of Joy collection rather dubiously and coldly. The audacity and unconventionality of the storiettes was a shock to bourgeois morality and prejudice. But when Paris went mad over the immediate translation that was made, the American and English reading public followed suit and bought so many copies that Martin compelled the conservative house of Singletree, Darnley and Company to pay a flat royalty of 25% for a third book and 30% flat for a fourth. These two volumes comprised all the short stories he had written and which had received, or were receiving, serial publication. The Ring of Bells and his horror stories constituted one collection. The other collection was composed of Adventure, The Pot, The Wine of Life, The Whirlpool, The Jostling Street, and 4 other stories. The Lowell Meredith Company captured the collection of all his essays, and the Maximilian Company got his sea lyrics and The Love Cycle, the latter receiving serial publication in the Ladies' Home Companion after the payment of an extortionate price. Martin heaved a sigh of relief when he had disposed of the last manuscript. The grass-walled castle and the white coppered schooner were very near to him. Well, at any rate, he had discovered Brissenden's contention that nothing of merit found its way into the magazines. His own success demonstrated that Brissenden had been wrong, and yet, somehow, he had a feeling that Brissenden had been right, after all. The shame of the Sun had been the cause of his success more than the stuff he had written. That stuff had been merely incidental. It had been rejected right and left by the magazines. The publication of The Shame of the Sun had started a controversy and precipitated the landslide in his favor. Had there been no Shame of the Sun, there would have been no landslide. And had there been no miracle in the go of The Shame of the Sun, there would have been no landslide. Singletree, Darnley and Company attested that miracle. They had brought out a first edition of 1,500 copies and been dubious of selling it. They were experienced publishers, and no one had been more astounded than they at the success which had followed. To them it had been in truth a miracle. They never got over it, and every letter they wrote him reflected their reverent awe of that first mysterious happening. They did not attempt to explain it. There was no explaining it. It had happened. In the face of all experience to the contrary, it had happened. So it was, reasoning thus, that Martin questioned the validity of his popularity. It was the bourgeoisie that bought his books and poured its gold into his money sack, and from what little he knew of the bourgeoisie, it was not clear to him how it could possibly appreciate or comprehend what he had written. His intrinsic beauty and power meant nothing to the hundreds of thousands who were acclaiming him and buying his books. He was the fad of the hour, the adventurer who had stormed Parnassus while the gods nodded. The hundreds of thousands read him and acclaimed him with the same brute non-understanding with which they had flung themselves on Brissenden's ephemera and torn it to pieces. A wolf rabble that fawned on him instead of fanging him. Fawn or fang, it was all a matter of chance. One thing he knew with absolute certitude. Ephemera was infinitely greater than anything he had done. It was infinitely greater than anything he had in him. It was a poem of centuries. Then the tribute the mob paid him was a sorry tribute indeed, for that same mob had wallowed ephemera into the mire. He sighed heavily and with satisfaction. He was glad the last manuscript was sold, and that he would soon be done with it all. End of chapter 43.